The morning arrived the way grief always does, quietly without permission. Cold light spilled across the empty streets of Harlow, Montana, pale and thin as watered-down milk. The kind of light that doesn't warm anything. It just reveals. Tall pines stood along the edges of the road like sentries who had stopped carrying their bark dark with overnight rain. Their silence absolute. The mountains beyond the town were half swallowed by cloud, their peaks invisible, as if the sky had decided that some things didn't need to be seen today. Maggie Calloway stood just outside the doors of St. Augustine's, the small white church at the end of Birch Street. And she did not cry. She had not cried at the hospital. She had not cried when the doctor came out to the hallway and used the words they always used, the careful, professional words designed to deliver devastation without making a scene. She had not cried driving home alone that night, or the night after, or the morning they called to confirm the arrangements. And now, standing in front of the place where Daniel's casket waited inside, she still felt nothing that resembled the grief she had been told to expect. What she felt instead was something quieter and far more unsettling. Emptiness. Not the soft, merciful kind that comes with shock. The hollow kind. The kind that had been growing in her chest since the moment she understood that Daniel was not coming back, and that the house, the mornings, the evenings, the silences, all of it, now belonged to her alone. She was 43 years old. She had served 8 years in the United States Navy as a special reconnaissance operator, one of the first women to hold that designation. And she had spent those years learning how to function in conditions that would break most people. Heat, cold, sleep deprivation, physical pain, the particular weight of knowing that the wrong decision could end lives. She had learned to move through all of it, steady, controlled, present. Standing outside this small church in this small Montana town, she understood for the first time that none of that training had prepared her for this. At her left side, Scout shifted his weight and pressed his shoulder gently against her calf. He was a German shepherd, 5 years old, black and tan with the kind of lean, disciplined build that came from years of working alongside soldiers rather than sitting beside them. He had served as a military K-9, trained in explosive detection, threat assessment, pattern recognition. He had been Daniel's dog first, technically. Daniel had been the one who made the calls, filled out the forms, navigated the adoption process when Scout was retired from service 2 years ago. But from the first night Scout came home, he had chosen Maggie. Not in the way dogs choose people at shelters, tails wagging, jumping for contact. In the quiet, deliberate way that working dogs make decisions, standing close, watching, learning the shape of her. He did not look up at her now. He did not need to. He simply stayed against her leg, warm and solid, while the cold Montana morning pressed down on everything else. Inside the church, the service lasted 40 minutes. Maggie sat in the front pew. People spoke. A pastor she barely knew said things about Daniel that were true, but incomplete the way things said about people in churches always are. Neighbors who had known them for 4 years said he was kind. A colleague from the university extension office said he was patient and thoughtful and genuinely curious about the natural world. All of it was true. None of it came close. What they didn't say, what no one in that church could have known, was that Daniel Calloway was the only person Maggie had ever met who did not treat her steadiness as something to admire from a distance. He had not been impressed by her toughness. He had not been intimidated by it either. He had simply lived alongside it, the way you live alongside a river, with respect, with attention, and without any desire to change its course. He had been the one who noticed when she was in pain and didn't say so. He had been the one who learned quietly and without announcement exactly how she took her tea. Scout sat at her feet throughout the service. He did not fidget. He did not react to the other people in the pews. The shifting of bodies, the occasional sound of weeping from somewhere behind her. He watched the space ahead of them with calm, steady attention, as if he too was simply waiting for something he could not yet name. After the burial, people touched Maggie's arm and said things she did not retain. She nodded. She thanked them. She did all the things that the moment required. And when the last person released her hand and turned away, she exhaled slowly through her nose and looked down at Scout. His amber eyes were already on her. They walked 3 blocks to the office of Edwin Marsh, the local attorney who had handled Daniel's affairs. It was a narrow building wedged between a hardware store and a barber shop that still had the same faded candy-striped pole it had when Maggie and Daniel first moved to Harlow. The inside smelled like old paper and the kind of coffee that has been sitting on a warmer for too long. Edwin Marsh was a small man in his 60s with careful movements and the kind of face that had carried other people's difficult news for so long. It had learned how to do it without flinching. He rose when Maggie entered, nodded, once gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm very sorry for your loss." She sat. Scout lowered himself beside her, but not fully relaxed. His ears stayed upright. There was someone else in the room. He was leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man who had decided in advance that none of this was going to affect him. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere around 50, wearing a charcoal jacket that was too city for this town. His dark hair was going gray at the temples, and his face had the arranged look of someone who had practiced being unreadable. His fingers tapped once against the armrest, then stopped. Cormac Holt, Daniel's cousin on his father's side. Maggie had met him 3 times in 4 years, once at a Christmas gathering, once at a funeral for Daniel's uncle, and once when he had shown up unannounced at their house on a Tuesday afternoon, with no explanation that fully satisfied her. Each time she had come away with the same impression, a man who evaluated everything in terms of what it was worth and what it might eventually be worth to him. "Maggie," he said with the practiced warmth of someone who knew her name but not much else about her. She did not answer. Edwin Marsh opened the folder on his desk and began to speak in the careful, measured cadence of a man who had delivered documents like these enough times to understand that pacing mattered. Daniel's estate was modest. The house, a savings account, a vehicle, standard arrangements. And then Edwin reached into the folder and placed 2 objects on the desk, a key and a map. The key was iron old, heavier looking than its size suggested, with a simple bow and a long barrel that belonged to an older kind of lock, the kind that required patience rather than precision. The map was hand-drawn on folded paper, the creases worn soft with handling. Someone had drawn it carefully, with attention to the bends in the terrain, the way the road curved and thinned as it went north into the forest. Maggie stared at them. "That's it," she said. Edwin hesitated. "There is also a property, land in the northern forest, approximately 19 miles from town. It includes a structure, Cormac exhaled through his nose something that wasn't quite a laugh. "The shack," he said. "Yeah, I know about that. Saw the paperwork once." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes moving between the key and Maggie with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "Daniel bought it years ago. Middle of nowhere. No real road to speak of. No utilities. Nothing out there but trees and whatever he dragged up there on his weekends." Maggie looked at him slowly. "He never mentioned it." Cormac shrugged. "Guess he had his projects." Scout's head lifted. It was a small movement, controlled, but Maggie had spent 2 years learning to read this animal, the way she had once learned to read terrain by paying attention to the details that other people missed. Scout's ears shifted forward. His body, which had been resting at an angle of calm vigilance, drew subtly upright, and from somewhere deep in his chest came a sound that was not quite a growl, lower than that, and slower. The kind of sound that was less a warning than a verdict. Cormac stiffened. "Control your dog." "He's controlled," Maggie said. Scout did not take his eyes off Cormac. Maggie looked back at the desk. She reached out and picked up the map, unfolding it with both hands. The lines were Daniel's. She recognized the particular way he drew, precise but slightly angular, always pressing a little harder than necessary. Her eyes moved across the paper. A road heading north. A bend to the left past what looked like a creek. A narrowing path between two ridges. And at the end of it, marked in a small, careful cross, a location deep in the forest, far from anything she recognized. Her fingers slowed. Something happened then that she could not immediately explain. Not a memory exactly. More like the edge of one, a smell faint and sudden cutting through the dry paper and coffee air of Edwin Marsh's office. Earthy green with something sweet beneath it. The way Daniel's jacket had smelled on certain evenings when he came home later than expected and said he'd been out walking. The way the kitchen had sometimes smelled on Sunday mornings when she came downstairs and found him already at the table, his notebooks closed. His expression a kind of relaxed she had never quite been able to read. She had never asked. She had always been too tired or too caught in her own interior, or simply too used to giving people the privacy of their own routines. Daniel had never asked her to explain the parts of herself she kept quiet. She had extended him the same courtesy, without ever considering what it might mean. Now, holding his map in a small attorney's office in Harlow, Montana, she wondered for the first time whether courtesy had been the right word for it. Scout shifted against her leg. She looked down. He was looking at the map, not at her, not at Cormac. At the map in her hands, his nose angled slightly forward, his nostrils moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm she recognized from his working days. The deep, measured inhale of an animal, processing information, sorting what it found, deciding what it meant. Then he made a sound she hadn't heard him make before, low, almost inaudible, somewhere between a whine and a breath. His tail moved once, just once, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes that had always seemed to hold more understanding than was comfortable to acknowledge. She felt something shift in her chest. Not grief, not quite. Something older than that and more specific. The weight of realizing that something had been happening right beside you, close enough to touch, and you had not known to look. She folded the map. She picked up the key. The iron was cold in her palm, and heavier than she had expected, the kind of weight that asked to be held rather than carried. She stood up. "Thank you, Edwin," she said. Cormac looked at her. "What are you going to do with it?" She didn't answer. She walked to the door, Scout beside her, and they stepped back out into the cold Montana morning. The house felt wrong when she returned to it. Not empty she had expected empty. Wrong as if the geometry of the rooms had changed in some way, too subtle to measure but too present to ignore. The furniture was where it had always been. The dishes on the drying rack were the ones she had washed 2 mornings ago. Daniel's reading glasses were on the table beside the couch, folded, waiting for a hand that was not coming back. She moved through the rooms slowly. In the kitchen, 2 mugs on the counter, one with a faint dried ring at the bottom hers. The other clean, unmarked, exactly where Daniel always left it at the end of the day. She picked it up, set it back down, stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the counter looking at nothing in particular. Scout moved through the rooms behind her at a respectful distance. Not underfoot, not anxious, not demanding anything, just present. Tracking her movement the way he had always tracked movement, with attention and without interference. Maggie went into Daniel's study. It was a small room at the back of the house with bookshelves along 2 walls and a window that looked out into the yard where a pair of birch trees stood bare, now their white bark almost luminous against the gray sky. The desk was neat. Daniel had always kept a neat desk. She stood in front of it for a moment, then sat in his chair, and for a while she simply sat in the room where he had spent his evenings, surrounded by his books and his careful organization, breathing the air that still smelled faintly of him. Then she began to look. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She had not made a decision to search, but her hands moved across the surface of the desk with the same methodical attention she had once applied to unfamiliar terrain, systematically unhurried, checking each surface before moving to the next. She found nothing unusual in the top drawer. Pens, a small notebook of phone numbers, a stapler, rubber bands. The second drawer held folders, household records, insurance documents, receipts. She pulled the third drawer open. Beneath a thin stack of utility bills, she found a folded piece of paper. She recognized it immediately as the same type Daniel used for his field notes. A specific brand of grid paper he bought in bulk from a store in Missoula and used for everything from plant diagrams to grocery lists. This piece had been folded 4 times and was soft at the creases from being opened and refolded many times. She unfolded it. It was an older version of the map. Rougher, earlier, with fewer details, but unmistakably the same place. The same road heading north. The same bend past the creek. The same ridge lines on either side of the path. And at the center, the same small, careful mark. She stared at it. Daniel had drawn this map before the one in the attorney's office. This was a working version, something you make when you are still figuring out the route. The other map, the one Edwin had given her, was a clean, final version, something you make when you want someone else to be able to follow. She thought about all the weekends he had said he was going for a drive, all the evenings he had come home with mud on his boots, and the tiredness of someone who has spent hours doing something physical outdoors. She thought about the smell on his jacket. She thought about the notebooks he had always closed when she walked into his study, and which she had never asked about, because she believed in privacy and the right of a person to have things that were entirely their own. She set the map down on the desk. For a moment, she just breathed. Then Scout walked in from the hallway, crossed the room, and placed his head in her lap. She put her hand on his neck. He was warm and very still. Outside, the wind moved through the birch trees and the white branches shifted against the gray sky, and Maggie Calloway sat in her dead husband's chair, holding a map he had drawn years ago to a place she had never known existed. "What did he build out there?" she whispered. Scout lifted his eyes to her face and held her gaze for a long moment. Then he exhaled slow and deep and settled his weight against her leg. She looked at the key on the desk beside her. She had set it there, without thinking, as if some part of her had already understood that this was where the evening was going to end up, in this chair, in this room with this iron weight sitting between her and whatever came next. She picked it up. The key was old. Not antique store old, not decorative. Old in the way of something that had been used, carried, trusted. The metal had a slight patina from handling, and the teeth of the barrel were worn smooth in the way of a key that had been turned often. Daniel had used this key regularly. Not once, not occasionally. Often enough that it had taken on the specific wear of something that was part of a person's routine. She had never seen it before in her life. She sat with that for a long time. Eventually, she rose from the chair, took the map from the desk, and carried both objects to the kitchen table. She spread the map out under the pendant light and looked at it carefully, the way she had once studied topographic maps before an operation, not just registering the information, but reading the intention behind it, the way the path had been marked, the landmarks chosen and the ones ignored, the small notations in the margins that she had not looked at closely in Edwin's office. She looked at them now. In the upper corner, written in Daniel's small, careful hand, "If you're reading this, take Scout." She went still. He had written this knowing she would be the one to read it. Not someday, maybe. Knowing. The map was not a memento. It was not a piece of his life she had stumbled across. It was an instruction. An invitation written in advance for the specific moment she was standing in right now. She looked at Scout. He was sitting at this kitchen doorway, watching her with the patient, expectant attention of an animal that has been waiting for a particular signal and has finally received it. She thought about all the times over the past 4 years that he had disappeared on a Saturday morning with Daniel heading out in the truck and returned in the late afternoon tired and calm in the specific way he got when he had been working. She had simply assumed that they were hiking, that Daniel was the kind of man who liked to walk in the woods, which he was, and that Scout was his companion in that which he also was. She had not considered the possibility that they were going somewhere specific, somewhere that Scout knew well enough that the map unfolded in this kitchen after a funeral had made him lean forward and breathe and move his tail against the floor. She folded the map, tucked it beside the key on the table, stood up, rolled her shoulders once against the familiar resistance in her lower back, the injury that had ended her Navy career and taken up permanent residence in her body, like an unwanted tenant, and looked at Scout. "You know where it is," she said. It wasn't a question. Scout stood up. She almost smiled. Almost. They left at 6 the next morning. The drive north took 40 minutes on pavement, and then another 30 on gravel roads that grew narrower and softer the deeper into the forest they went. The truck's headlights cut through pre-dawn dark. At first, then gradually the sky went from black to purple to the pale, fragile gray of early Montana morning. Pines crowded the road on both sides, tall and close, their lower branches beginning to fade as the upper canopy caught the first real light. Scout rode in the passenger seat. He always had. Daniel had started it, letting him sit up front on longer drives, and the habit had stuck. He sat straight-backed, watching the road ahead through the windshield with the focused attention of an animal who understood that where you were going mattered. Maggie drove without the radio. She had not turned it on since Daniel died. The silence in the truck was different from the silence in the house. It moved with them, it had direction. It felt less like absence and more like waiting. She checked the map twice, pulling off the road at a wide spot to orient herself against the terrain. The creek crossing was right where Daniel had marked it, a narrow wooden bridge with no railing that she crossed at about 5 miles an hour. Beyond it, the road became little more than 2 tire tracks in the earth grass, growing up the middle, the forest pressing in from both sides, until the sky was a thin, pale ribbon above them. She drove until the tracks ended in a small, natural clearing, and then she stopped and looked through the windshield and felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. The cabin sat at the far edge of the clearing against the tree line, and she might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been looking for something human-made in all that green. Because what stood there did not look like a structure so much as something the forest had grown around and absorbed. Vines covered every surface, thick as rope, in places thinner and more recent, in others tracing patterns up the walls and over the roof line that were too consistent to be entirely accidental. White flowers bloomed in clusters at intervals along the vines, small and dense, their petals catching the morning light with a brightness that made them look almost placed. Purple blooms curled around what she could now recognize as window frames. Moss had crept along the base, soft and deep, reclaiming the foundation with the patient determination of something that had decided years ago that this belonged to the earth. It was not abandoned. That was the thing she understood immediately. Stepping out of the truck into the cold morning air, this was not a place that had been left to decay. It had been tended. The vines had been guided. She could see it in the patterns, in the way certain growth had been encouraged and other growth trimmed back. The flowers were not wild volunteers. They had been planted with intention and maintained and cared for across seasons that Maggie had spent entirely unaware that this place existed. Scout landed beside her without a sound. He stood for a moment, nose lifted, working the air with slow, deep inhales. Then he looked at the cabin with an expression Maggie could only describe as recognition. The settled, certain look of an animal returning to a known place rather than encountering something new. He had been here before, many times. With Daniel. She followed him across the clearing. The grass was wet with dew and gave softly underfoot. As she got closer to the cabin, the door revealed itself through a curtain of vines, old weathered gray but solid. The frame set true. A heavy iron lock sat at its center, and she already had her hand in her jacket pocket, already felt the weight of the key before she reached it. She paused with her hand on the vines. Above the doorway, tangled into the thicker growth, hung clusters of small white flowers, jasmine or something very close to it. The scent reached her before she had consciously registered what she was smelling. Sweet, warm, specific. The exact smell she had encountered on Daniel's jacket on those late Saturday evenings when he came home tired and quiet and more settled than usual. She had always thought it was simply the outdoor air. some combination of forest and distance and the particular quality of mountain evening. She closed her eyes. She let herself stand there for a moment, just breathing. When she opened her eyes, Scout was sitting at the door looking up at her. She slid the key into the lock. It fit with the easy precision of a thing designed exactly for this purpose. She turned it. At first, nothing. Then a deep, solid click that resonated in the cold morning air. She put her shoulder to the door. The wood had swollen from weather and seasons, and it resisted not much, but enough that she had to lean into it, feel the familiar complaint in her lower back, and push through both until the door gave way with a long, low groan of hinges. As it opened, something fell. A cascade of white petals loosened from the cluster of flowers above the frame, drifted down around her in the still morning air. They fell, slowly turning as they came settling on the threshold on the ground on her shoulders. Scout stepped back from them, startled. Not frightened, just surprised by the softness of it, the unexpectedness. And Maggie stood in the doorway while petals fell around her and breathed in the smell of jasmine and old wood, and something deeper beneath both of those things, green and earthy and alive. She stepped inside. The darkness resolved slowly under the beam of her flashlight. Wooden shelves along two walls lined with glass jars of varying sizes, each one sealed and labeled in small, neat handwriting. Bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling beams in dense clusters, their stems bound with twine, their colors muted by drying but still distinct. Deep green, pale gray-green, reddish-brown. A work table along the far wall held more jars. Some open a mortar and pestle a small scale. A series of notations on loose paper. And on a low shelf near the work table, a row of notebooks. Spiral-bound, identical in size, labeled along the spines in Daniel's hand. Not subjects, not projects. Dates. A span of years that went back further than she had expected, further back than she had let herself think about, before she opened the door. She walked to the shelf and looked at the dates. The first notebook began 12 years ago. She stood very still. Scout moved past her into the center of the room. His paws made almost no sound on the old floorboards. He moved with the focused, methodical pattern she recognized from his working years not exploring mapping. Head low, body level, moving in a slow, deliberate arc from one side of the room to the other. His nose working the whole time, sorting the layers of scent in this enclosed space, the way he had once sorted the contents of shipping containers and vehicle trunks and desert encampments. Then he stopped. He was standing in the center of the room, equidistant from every wall. He stood motionless for a moment. Then he lowered himself to the floor, settling his body against the boards with a slow, deliberate care that Maggie recognized immediately. She had not seen him do this since his last working deployment. It was a specific posture, not resting, not surrendering, locating. The controlled, intentional lowering of a K-9 who has found what he was trained to find and is communicating that finding without ambiguity. In the field, it meant here, this location. Whatever you are looking for, it is beneath me. Maggie's pulse slowed. She crossed the room and crouched beside him. She pressed one hand against the floorboard. Solid. She moved her hand 6 inches. The same. Then a foot to the left, and her hand felt it, a difference so subtle she might have dismissed it if she hadn't been looking for it. A faint give, a resonance beneath the surface that wasn't quite the same as the boards on either side. She knocked once with her knuckle. The sound that came back was not the flat, dense sound of solid wood over solid earth. It was hollow. She exhaled slowly, looked at Scout. He was watching her with calm, patient attention, his chin resting on the floor, his amber eyes steady. "Good boy," she said quietly. He did not respond. He simply waited. She began to look for the edge. She was still crouched on the floor, running her fingers along the board seams when she heard it. A footstep. Then another. The sound of weight on dry ground outside, careful weight, placed with intention. The way someone moves when they do not want to announce themselves, but have not yet decided what to do about the fact that they will be heard anyway. She did not stand up. She simply turned her head toward the doorway and waited. Scout rose from the floor in one smooth, silent movement. He turned to face the entrance. His body shifted from locate to assess, every line of him oriented toward the door, every sense redirected. Cormac Holt stepped into the frame. He stood in the entrance with the air of a man who had rehearsed, looking relaxed, and had mostly succeeded. His jacket was less clean than it had been at the attorney's office. The drive up the gravel road had left its mark. His boots were dusty. He looked around the cabin with the eyes of someone cataloging rather than experiencing, his gaze moving from the shelves to the table, to the floor, where the edge of the hidden hatch was now partially visible, where Maggie had been working at the boards. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but she saw it, the slight sharpening of attention, the almost imperceptible forward lean of a man who has just seen something he considers significant. "Well," he said in a voice that was working hard to stay casual, "you actually came." Maggie stood slowly. "You followed me." "I prefer to think of it as taking an interest." He took a step into the room. "Daniel never told me much about this place. I always figured it was just one of his eccentric little projects." His eyes moved to the shelves, the jars, the notebooks. Something in his expression shifted again, recalibration. "But looking at all this," Scout stepped forward, not charging, not barking. One step placed with precision. His body squarely between Cormac and the center of the room, his eyes locked on the man with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal that has made a decision. Then he barked. Once. Enormous. The sound filled the cabin, completely bouncing off the low ceiling and the glass jars, and the dried plants pressing against every surface simultaneously. Cormac lurched backward, one hand coming up instinctively, his composed expression breaking for a full second before he could reassemble it. He recovered, looked at Scout with something that wanted to be contempt, but landed closer to wariness. "Your dog has boundary issues." "No," Maggie said evenly. "He has very good boundaries. You should leave." Cormac held her gaze for a moment. He was deciding something. She could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, the weighing of what he knew against what he wanted, and what pushing further right now might cost him versus what waiting might gain. He chose waiting. He took a step back toward the door, then paused with something almost careful in his expression. Almost honest. "Someone from outside came looking for Daniel last year," he said. "Asked about his research. Clean shoes, clean hands. Not from around here. They were looking for something specific. He held her gaze a moment longer. Just thought you should know. Then he turned and walked back across the clearing. Scout did not watch him go. He turned his head toward the back of the cabin, toward the tree line beyond the far wall. Maggie followed his gaze. Through the gap where the door still stood open, she could see the edge of the clearing, the beginning of the trees, the deep shadow between the trunks where the morning light had not yet reached. A shape stood there, still, human, watching. Then it was gone. Stepped back into the forest with the quiet economy of someone who had been standing there long enough to know how to leave without making a sound. Maggie stood in the doorway of Daniel's cabin with the smell of jasmine still in the air around her, and Scout at her side, and she understood that she was not the only person who had come looking for what her husband had built here. She looked at the iron key in her hand, worn smooth by years of Daniel's handling. She looked at the notebooks on the shelf. 12 years of them. She looked at the floor, at the hidden space beneath it that Scout had found with the same certainty he had once brought to every task he had ever been trained for. And Maggie Calloway, who had spent 8 years learning how to hold a line under pressure, who had come home from her last deployment with a back injury that the doctors had called permanent, and that she had spent 12 years quietly carrying, who had stood at her husband's graveside that morning and felt nothing but the cold. That woman made a decision. She closed the door behind her. She walked to the shelf and took down the first notebook. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and Scout pressed against her side, his warmth steady and certain in the cool morning air. She opened the cover, and she began to read. The first page was dated 12 years ago, written in the particular way Daniel wrote when he was thinking rather than recording the letters slightly larger than usual. The pressure on the pen lighter as if he hadn't yet decided whether the words deserved to be permanent. She read the first line twice. Day 1. Maggie came home from Bethesda with the discharge papers and a prescription she won't fill, and a way of moving through the house that she thinks I don't notice. I notice. I notice everything. Maggie stopped. She looked at the wall across from her. The jars on the shelves caught the light coming through the vine-covered window in small fragments, and the dried plants overhead shifted slightly in a current of air she couldn't identify. Scout was a steady warmth against her left side, his breathing slow and even. She looked back at the page. The doctor used the word chronic. Maggie nodded when he said it, the way she nods at everything she has decided not to argue with complete agreement. On the surface, absolute refusal underneath. I know that nod. I have watched that nod for 7 years. What it means is you can say what you want. I have already made my decision. I have not told her that I looked up every study published on spinal nerve compression in the last 10 years. I have not told her that I spent 4 hours last night reading botanical research that probably has nothing to do with anything. I have not told her any of this because she would tell me to stop, and I am not going to stop. I don't know if any of this will work. I don't know enough yet to know what working would even look like. But I know what I saw in her face when the doctor said the word chronic, and I know I am not willing to accept it as the final answer. Maggie closed the notebook. She sat with it closed in her lap for a long moment, her hands flat on the cover, and she breathed carefully, the way she had learned to breathe when something was happening inside her that she needed to stay ahead of. in through the nose, slow count out through the mouth. The technique that had gotten her through 3 combat deployments and a surgery in the night Daniel told her his diagnosis and every difficult morning since. It was not working particularly well right now. Scout turned his head and looked at her face. She opened the notebook again. She read for a long time. The early entries were technical. In a way she hadn't expected, Daniel had approached this the way he approached everything he cared about, which was with the thoroughness of someone who understood that caring about something was not the same as understanding it, and that understanding required work. He had read. He had studied. He had driven to Missoula twice a month to use the university library, telling her he was meeting with colleagues from the extension office, which was partially true and more than partially not. He had cataloged every plant in a 50-mile radius that had any documented history of use in pain management, nerve repair, inflammation reduction. He had cross-referenced traditional uses with available chemical analysis. He had corresponded carefully and obliquely with researchers at 3 different universities, framing his questions as general interest rather than active investigation. He had failed repeatedly in the way that careful people fail thoroughly with documentation and without giving up. Extraction attempt 14. One entry read, "The compound broke down in under 6 hours. Not useful. Starting over with a different solvent base. I felt genuinely foolish today driving home with a trunk full of failed samples and 2 hours of sleep. Then I stopped at the bridge on Route 9 and watched the river for a while and remembered why I started. I remembered how she moves in the morning when she thinks no one is watching. The particular way she adjusts her route through the kitchen to avoid the reach that hurts. The way she sits down in stages rather than all at once. She thinks she hides it. She doesn't hide it. Starting over tomorrow. Maggie set the notebook down and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and held it there. Outside, a breeze moved through the clearing. The vines against the cabin wall shifted, and the white flowers turned, and the jasmine smell deepened for a moment, and then settled back. Scout stood up, walked 3 steps, and lay down directly across her feet, the full weight of him warm and deliberate. She reached down and rested her hand on his back, without looking away from the wall. After a while, she picked up the notebook again. The entries changed around year 4. Something in the handwriting steadier, more compact. The confidence of someone who has stopped wondering whether they are doing the right thing and started wondering how to do it better. And a new name appeared in the margins, then in the body of the text, then with increasing frequency, until it became simply a given. Spoke with Nora again today, or a Nora thinks the stabilization window can be extended if we adjust the temperature during the secondary extraction. Nora was right about the carrier compound. I should have listened 3 weeks ago. Dr. Nora Vance, mentioned without introduction, as if Maggie already knew her, which of course she didn't, because this was Daniel's other life, the one he had built in parallel with the one they shared, fitting it into the margins of Saturdays and the white space of the hours she assumed he spent simply being himself in the world. She was not angry. She had expected to be angry, or had assumed that anger would be the appropriate response to discovering that your husband had spent 12 years keeping something significant from you. But what she felt instead was more complicated and less manageable than anger. It was the grief of understanding too late the full dimensions of someone you thought you already knew completely. Daniel had not hidden this from her out of dishonesty. He had hidden it out of love and out of a precise understanding of who she was. He had known she would have told him to stop. He had known she would have called it unnecessary or excessive, or a distraction from the things that actually needed his attention. He had known she would have been wrong, and he had also known that telling her so would not have changed her mind. So he had simply continued. For 12 years, she reached into the hatch and removed the metal box she had identified earlier, setting it on the floor beside her. She had seen it when she first found the hollow rectangular flat, cold-latched rather than locked. She had noticed its weight and filed it for later because there was only so much a person could take in at once. Even a person trained to process information under pressure. She opened it now. Inside, arranged in 2 neat rows, were sealed envelopes, each one labeled in Daniel's hand. Not scientific designations, not case numbers. Names, first and last, written with the same care he brought to everything legible, considered as if the names of the people they represented deserved to be written properly. She lifted the first one, Arlo Kavanaugh. The second, Delbert Pruitt. Another Case 7 referred by NV chronic nerve compression lower lumbar. She opened that one and removed the single folded sheet inside. Daniel's handwriting, careful and precise. Week 3 follow-up. Subject reports significant reduction in pain intensity during waking hours. Sleep duration improved from approximately 4 hours to 6.5. No adverse effects observed. Recommends continuing current dosage. Further monitoring needed before drawing conclusions. Maggie sat with the paper in her hand and looked at it for a long time. This was not a hobby. This was not an eccentric private interest that had gotten out of hand. This was a body of work, 12 years of it, built carefully and deliberately, expanded from one person to many, documented with the rigor of someone who understood that documentation was the difference between something real and something that could be dismissed. He had been helping people, quietly, without recognition, without payment, without anyone knowing his name. People in pain referred through Nora Vance, who apparently understood what he was building well enough to trust it with her own network. Maggie placed the paper back in the envelope and set it gently with the others. Then she saw it. At the back of the box, partially beneath the last row of envelopes, one more, smaller than the others. No last name, no case number. Just Maggie. She did not move for a moment. Then she reached in and took it out. The envelope was sealed. The paper inside had a slight thickness to it, not a single sheet, but 2 or 3. The handwriting on the front was the same as all the others, but pressed slightly harder the way Daniel's hand moved when he was writing something he had thought about for a long time before putting down. She turned it over. Sealed. Intact. No sign that it had ever been opened. She broke the seal carefully, the way she did everything carefully, when it mattered, and removed the pages inside and unfolded them. Maggie, if you're reading this, then I didn't get to tell you myself. I had planned for that possibility. You know me, I plan for things, but I want you to know that planning for it didn't make it easier to accept. It only made it feel more real. I need to tell you some things I should have told you years ago. I didn't tell you because I knew what you would say. and I knew you would be trying to protect me from the work. And I also knew that the work was the most important thing I had ever done, and I was not willing to stop. You have been in pain for 12 years. You have carried it the way you carry everything, without complaint, without asking for accommodation, with the stubbornness of a woman who decided a long time ago that her difficulties were her own business. I have watched you do this every day. I have watched you adjust your movement, your posture, your route through rooms, the way you sit and stand and reach for things. And I have watched you pretend that none of it was happening, and I have loved you through all of it, while working on the thing I believed could change it. The tea I made you every evening, the blend you called my special recipe, was not just tea. I need you to know that. What I added to it was harmless and carefully calibrated, and I monitored your response for months before I was confident, but it was not just tea. I was giving you small doses of the compound I had been developing and watching what happened and recording it and adjusting, and what I found was that it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but it worked. Your pain was reduced, not eliminated, but reduced enough that I believe a proper formulation, properly dosed, could do significantly more. The notebooks will tell you everything. The process, the formulation, the results. Nora Vance will help you understand the parts that are technical. Her number is in the back cover of the last notebook. What I need you to decide, and I am asking you to decide it, not telling you, because you have always made your own decisions, and I would not change that about you for anything in the world, is what to do with what I've built. There are people who will come for it. I know this because some of them have already been asking questions, and I have been careful. But careful has limits. They will tell you it should be developed properly, which is true. They will tell you the resources required are beyond what you have, which is also true. What they will not tell you is what they intend to do with it once they have it. And that is the question that matters most. I built this for you. I kept building it because I understood it could help others. I did not build it to make anyone rich. Whatever you decide, I need you to know. One thing, I did not do this alone. I did it with you. You just didn't know yet. That's all. Take Scout with you when you go to the cabin. He knows the way. I love you. I always have. I am very sorry I ran out of time. Daniel. Maggie folded the letter. She folded it slowly, each crease deliberate, pressing the paper flat with both hands. She placed it back in the envelope. She held the envelope in her lap with both hands and looked at the middle distance and let herself be completely still for a while. The cabin was quiet around her. The dried plants overhead moved in a slow current. The jars caught and held fragments of light. Scout had not moved from her feet, and his weight was an anchor she was grateful for. She did not cry, but she sat with the envelope in her hands for a very long time, and she understood something that she had not understood before. Not the research, not the compound, not even the sacrifice of it. Something simpler and more total than all of that. He had seen her, not the version of her she presented to the world. The steady one, the capable one, the one who did not ask for help, and did not admit to pain, and did not allow her difficulties to become other people's problems. He had seen through that version completely. the way only someone paying very close attention for a very long time can see through a thing. And he had decided that what he saw deserved to be addressed, and he had spent 12 years addressing it in the only way she would have allowed, without her knowledge, without her permission, with complete and total love. She put the letter in her jacket pocket. She stood up. She walked to the work table and looked at the jars there. Picked one up, the one labeled in Daniel's hand, with a notation she now recognized from the notebooks, the formulation number that corresponded to the final version of the compound. The liquid inside was dark green, almost opaque, with a faint shimmer when the light caught it from a particular angle. She set it down. Not yet. She went to the shelf and took down the last notebook. The most recent one, its spine still stiff, its pages less worn than the earlier volumes. She turned to the back cover. There, written in Daniel's hand, was a phone number and 2 words beneath it. Nora Vance. She had just put the notebook under her arm when Scout stood up. The movement was immediate and complete. One moment lying down, the next fully upright, every sense redirected. He faced the doorway. He did not growl. He did not bark. He stood with his ears angled forward and his body absolutely still and breathed. Maggie went still with him. She had learned a long time ago to trust this. Not because Scout was infallible, but because his signal discipline was exceptional. He did not raise an alert without cause, and the character of the alert told you something about the nature of the cause. A growl meant danger, recognized and categorized. A bark meant immediate action required. This standing stillness, this focused silence meant something that didn't fit an existing category, something that required assessment. She waited. The sound came from outside, from the edge of the clearing. Careful footsteps on ground that was damp enough to register weight, slow enough to suggest either caution or difficulty. She moved to the doorway without making a sound and looked out. A man stood at the edge of the tree line. He was not Cormac. He was older, thinner, wearing clothes that had been washed many times and had the shapelessness of things kept past their useful life. He stood with his weight slightly favoring his left side, and even at this distance, Maggie could see the effort it cost him to stand straight. He was looking at the cabin with the expression of someone who has been hoping for something and has not yet decided whether what they are seeing is the thing they hoped for. She stepped out of the doorway. He saw her. Didn't run, didn't speak. Just watched her come across the clearing toward him with the stillness of someone who had used up most of his available energy just getting here and had none left over for reaction. Scout walked beside her. When they were close enough for the man to see the dog clearly, he let out a slow breath and some of the tension went out of his shoulders. She said there'd be a dog, the man said. Maggie stopped a few feet from him. Who are you? Arlo Cavanaugh. He said it like a person who has given their name to many people in official contexts and has learned to offer it plainly. I'm sorry to come out here like this. I didn't know how else to find the place. You've been here before. It wasn't a question. He looked at the cabin with eyes that confirmed it. A few times. Daniel showed me a couple of years back. I knew about the property. He shifted his weight, and she saw the small wince he was too practiced to fully suppress. I've been coming back since he passed, hoping someone would show up, hoping the work didn't just end. Maggie studied him for a moment. Scout had moved to the man's left side and stood there, without touching him. Calm and close, his presence neither challenging nor demanding. He had made a decision about Arlo Kavanaugh, and the decision was acceptable. She trusted that. "Come inside," she said. He sat on the low bench along the cabin wall and told her his story without being asked to, in the direct, unhurried way of someone who has carried something for a long time and is relieved to set it down. Peripheral neuropathy, progressing over 6 years. The kind of nerve damage that conventional medicine managed rather than treated with medications that took the edge off, and side effects that created new problems. He had been referred to Daniel through a physical therapist in Missoula who knew Nora Vance, who had apparently been quietly connecting people for longer than Maggie had realized. 3 weeks after I started, I slept through the night for the first time in 4 years, Arlo said. He said it simply, without drama. Not cured, not fixed, but reduced, manageable. He looked at his hands. "I'm not here to make a claim on anything. I understand this isn't mine. I came because I needed to know if there was someone who was going to continue it, or if I needed to start figuring out something else." Maggie looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. "There's going to be someone." He let out a breath. She walked him back to his truck at the edge of the clearing, an old Silverado with a cracked passenger mirror and mud on the running boards. And she was nearly back to the cabin door when he called after her. "One more thing." He was standing by the driver's door, one hand on the frame. "About a week before you came out here, there was another vehicle. Parked right where you're parked now. 2 men. Nice clothes, nice car. They walked the perimeter of the cabin, took photographs, measured some things." He paused. "They couldn't get in. But before they left, one of them crouched down by the front step for a bit. I was watching from the trees. Didn't know who they were, didn't want to show myself." Maggie walked back to the front step. She crouched, ran her hand along the underside of the lowest wooden riser along the back edge of the step, where the shadow was deepest. Her fingers found it immediately, a small flat device, no larger than a matchbook, adhered to the wood with the decisiveness of something placed to stay. She peeled it off, held it up. A GPS tracker, commercial grade, the kind available online and used by people who needed to monitor locations without being present. Someone had been tracking this cabin. Tracking who came here, when, how often. Waiting. She set it on the step, placed her heel on it, pressed down, until she felt and heard it give. She swept the fragments off the step with her boot. She looked at Arlo. "Thank you." He nodded, got in his truck, left. The next morning arrived with the clarity that follows a night of insufficient sleep. Everything too bright to define the edges of things sharper than they needed to be. Maggie had spent the night in the cabin on the narrow cot she had found folded against the back wall under a blanket that smelled like Daniel's coat. She had slept for perhaps 3 hours. Scout had slept across the threshold of the door. She was at the work table when she heard the engine, not the sound of a vehicle that had gotten lost on a forest road. The sound of a vehicle driven with purpose by someone who knew exactly where they were going. She stepped outside and stood in the clearing and watched a black SUV emerge from the tree line and stop at the far edge with the practiced precision of a vehicle whose driver was accustomed to arrivals that made an impression. 2 men got out. The first she had not met but recognized immediately by type. The bearing, the quality of the coat. the way he assessed the clearing before his feet had fully settled on the ground. Mid to late 40s, lean with the composed features of a man who had learned that stillness conveyed authority more effectively than movement. He adjusted his collar once unnecessarily and walked toward her with the measured pace of someone who had decided in advance that this conversation would go the way he intended. Warren Sloan. The second man was older, taller, slightly stooped wire-frame glasses, a dark overcoat that had cost more than most people in Harlow earned in a month. He moved more slowly than Sloan, but with the patience of someone who understood that he didn't need to be first, that the words, when they came, would do the work. Aldrich Pemberton. They stopped about 10 feet from her. "Mrs. Calloway," Sloan said. His voice was calibrated warm enough to invite, controlled enough to remind you who was controlling it. "My name is Warren Sloan. I represent a private investment group with interests in medical research and pharmaceutical development." He gestured briefly toward the older man. "This is Aldrich Pemberton, our legal representative." Pemberton inclined his head slightly. Maggie said nothing. Sloan continued undeterred. "We've been following your late husband's work with considerable interest for some time. What he accomplished here is genuinely remarkable. With the right resources and infrastructure, the research could be developed into something with very significant real-world applications." "Significant financial applications," Maggie said. Sloan did not miss a beat. "Those aren't mutually exclusive with medical benefit." Pemberton opened the leather case he was carrying and removed a document, a single sheaf of papers folded once, which he extended toward her. "A preliminary offer," he said. His voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who had drafted more contracts than he could count and had stopped being impressed by numbers a long time ago. $5 million for the full rights to the research, the formulation, all associated documentation, and the property itself. The number settled into the clearing the way large numbers do with a brief, particular silence. Maggie did not take the document. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Sloan. "How did you find out about this place?" Something crossed Sloan's face. Not guilt, not quite, a recalibration. "We've been conducting due diligence for some time. Research of this nature generates signals even when the researcher intends otherwise." Maggie held his gaze. "Who told you?" It was not a question. Sloan recognized that. He held her gaze for a moment, then said, "We identified the property through various channels." She said nothing. Let the silence do what silence does. Sloan pressed forward. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be direct with you. $5 million is a serious number. What you have here without resources, without legal protection, without a development framework, is vulnerable. Intellectual property that isn't properly protected can be challenged, replicated, claimed by others. We are offering you security. We are offering you certainty. You're offering me a clean exit," Maggie said. "We're offering you what this research is worth to you personally right now. And what it's worth to everyone else is a different number." Sloan paused, reassessed. "What would you need to consider the offer seriously?" "Nothing," she said. "I'm not selling." Pemberton's expression did not change. He refolded the document and returned it to his case with the same methodical efficiency with which he had removed it. Sloan looked at her for a moment longer. And in that moment, she saw something shift in his composure. Not anger, not frustration. The controlled expression of a man who is prepared for this outcome and has already moved on to the next step in the plan. "I understand," he said. "I hope you'll reconsider. The offer will remain open." He glanced at Scout, who had been standing 2 feet to Maggie's left throughout the entire conversation, motionless, watching. "We'll be in touch." He turned back toward the SUV, and as he turned, Maggie saw it. The rear passenger window was partially lowered, and in the gap just visible in the interior shadow was a face she recognized. The shape of it, the set of the shoulders. Cormac Holt. He was sitting in the back of Warren Sloane's vehicle, looking straight ahead, not meeting her eyes. He had been there throughout the entire conversation. He had not gotten out. He had not introduced himself or acknowledged her or done anything at all to indicate that he was present. He had simply sat there, having already done whatever he had come to do, which was to bring these men to this place. The SUV's doors closed. The engine started. The vehicle reversed smoothly and disappeared back into the tree line. Maggie stood in the clearing and watched it go. Scout moved closer, his shoulder against her leg. She looked down at him. He was watching the tree line where the SUV had gone with a focused, unwavering attention. She recognized not the assessment posture he used for unknowns, not the alert posture he used for threats. Something that sat between the two. The look of an animal that has been watching something develop over time and has now received the information it needed to complete its judgment. She put her hand on his head. "I know," she said quietly. She went back inside. She stood at the work table for a long moment, looking at the jar with Daniel's final formulation inside it. The dark green liquid, the slight shimmer. 12 years of work in a jar no bigger than her fist. She picked it up, removed the stopper. The smell rose immediately, earthy sharp, with a faint sweetness she now recognized as one of the specific plant compounds Daniel had spent the better part of year 3 trying to stabilize. She replaced the stopper, set the jar down. She found the small metal measuring cup on the shelf, where Daniel had kept it with a notation taped to the handle indicating the dose he had settled on for a person of her approximate weight. After years of careful calibration, she measured. She added water from the canteen she had brought. She looked at the cup. Scout sat to her right and looked at it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. "He did this for years," she said. Not to Scout specifically. To the room. To Daniel. To the cabin and the notebooks and the 12 years of careful, quiet love that surrounded her on every side. She drank it. It tasted of earth and green things and something faintly bitter underneath the way useful things often are. She set the cup down and leaned against the work table and waited. Nothing happened for several minutes. She expected nothing. She was a patient woman. Then, quietly, without announcement, something changed. It was not a disappearance. She had not expected a disappearance. It was a distance, as if the pain that had been her constant companion for 12 years had simply moved back one step. Still present. Still hers. But no longer sitting directly on top of her every movement, no longer the first thing her body reported every time she adjusted her position. She straightened slowly, rolled her left shoulder, waited for the familiar complaint. It came, but quieter, from further away. She stood up straight, completely straight, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, and felt the absence of what that usually cost her. Scout walked to her and sat at her feet, and he looked up at her face with those amber eyes, and he held her gaze for a long moment in the still cabin, while the afternoon light came through the vines in fragments, and the smell of jasmine and dried plants filled the air around them both. She pressed her hand to her sternum. "He was right," she said quietly. Scout's tail moved once deliberate. She stood there for a while, breathing, feeling the changed quality of her own body, understanding fully for the first time what 12 years of quiet work by a man she had thought she knew completely had actually been building toward. She thought about Arlo Kavanaugh standing at the edge of the tree line that morning, with his weight shifted to ease a pain she recognized. She thought about the other names in the envelopes. She thought about what Sloan had said with the right resources the research could be developed. And she thought about what he had carefully not said, which was, and it would belong to us. She sealed the jar, returned it to the vault, sealed the hatch. She picked up the last notebook and opened the back cover and looked at the number Daniel had written there. She picked up her phone. The phone rang twice before she answered. Dr. Vance. The voice was exactly what Maggie had expected. Clear, economical, the tone of someone who had learned that information mattered more than warmth in a first impression. No wasted syllables. Just the name offered like a credential. "My name is Maggie Calloway," Maggie said. "Daniel's wife." The silence that followed was brief but complete. Not the silence of someone caught off guard. The silence of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just heard it arrive. "Maggie." Something shifted in Nora Vance's voice, not softness exactly, but a change in density. The careful compression of a person who is managing something real. "I've been hoping you would call. I didn't know if you'd found the number." Back cover of the last notebook. That's where he said he'd put it. A pause. "I'm so sorry about Daniel. I know it isn't enough. But I need you to know that what he built was real and it mattered, and I am very sorry he didn't get more time with it." Maggie looked at the jar on the work table. The afternoon light had shifted, and the green of the liquid was deeper now, almost black at the center. "He told me about you. In the letter. He wrote you a letter 6 months before he died." Another pause. Longer this time. "That sounds like him." Her voice was quieter on those 4 words, the quietness of grief that has been carried long enough to become load-bearing. He was very deliberate about things. "I need to understand what I'm dealing with," Maggie said. "I've read the notebooks, I understand the research. What I don't understand yet is the outside of it, who knows about this, how much they know, and what kind of time I have before it stops being mine to decide about." The shift in Nora's voice was immediate. Back to the first register, focused, clear, direct. "How much has already happened?" Maggie told her. "The attorney's office, Cormac. The cabin, the GPS tracker. Arlo Kavanaugh at the tree line. Warren Sloan and Aldrich Pemberton with their black SUV and their $5 million document and their careful, practiced certainty. Cormac in the back seat saying nothing. Nora listened without interrupting, When Maggie finished, there was a silence that felt like calculation rather than hesitation. Sloane's group has been circling this for at least 8 months, Nora said. I knew they were aware of Daniel's work. They reached out to me through an intermediary last spring framed as academic interest. I told them I didn't know what they were referring to, but they're not going away, and now that Daniel is gone and the estate has transferred, they'll move faster. She paused. 5 million was an opening number. That means they believe it's worth significantly more. The IP isn't registered, Maggie said. No. Daniel was deliberate about that too. He didn't want to trigger any filing processes that might surface the work before it was ready. Which means right now, if someone with resources and legal infrastructure were to synthesize the publicly observable components and file first, she stopped. You understand what I'm saying? They could own it. They could claim it. Whether they could hold it in court is a different question. But litigation takes years and money, and they know that. Another pause. Maggie, how quickly can you get the documentation together? The full research record, the correspondence, the dated notebooks. Everything is here at the cabin. I have it. I need to come to you. It was not a request. Not quite. But it wasn't a demand either. It was the statement of a person who has assessed a situation and identified the correct next step. I can be in Harlow by tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be here, Maggie said. She arrived at 7:55. Maggie heard the truck before she saw it. A sound different from Sloane's SUV, rougher the specific engine note of a vehicle that had been maintained rather than replaced. A dark green Ford Ranger emerged from the tree line and pulled into the clearing. And the woman who got out was exactly what the notebooks had suggested, and nothing like what a person meeting her cold might have expected. Dr. Nora Vance was 38 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that came from field work rather than a gym functional capable entirely unself-conscious. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in the practical way of someone who didn't want it in her face while she was working. She wore a field jacket with actual wear on the elbows, and her boots were the same kind Maggie owned, the kind that cost enough to last and were bought to be used, not displayed. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a leather case under her arm, and she crossed the clearing with a direct, unhurried stride that Maggie recognized as the walk of someone who always knew exactly where they were going. She stopped in front of Maggie, looked at her with sharp, attentive eyes that performed a quick, thorough assessment before settling. Maggie Calloway, she said. Nora Vance. They shook hands the way two people shake hands when they already understand each other from context. Firm, brief, no performance. Nora looked at the cabin. Something moved across her face. Not sentimentality exactly, but a response she couldn't entirely suppress when she saw a place that mattered. He kept it well, she said. He kept everything well, Maggie said. They went inside. Nora moved through the cabin with the familiarity of someone returning rather than arriving. She knew where the notebooks were shelved, the organization of the jars, paused at the work table and ran 2 fingers along its surface with the attention of a person checking whether things were as they had left them. She opened 2 of the jars, smelled them, resealed them. She looked at the last 3 notebooks with her hands, rather than her eyes feeling the state of the spines, the wear on the covers. Then she sat down at the work table and opened her leather case. I'm going to be direct with you, she said, because I think that's what you prefer, and because we don't have time for anything else. Go ahead. The research is real. The formulation works. I've observed the results in 9 individuals over 4 years with Daniel's oversight, and the results are consistent. It's not a cure. Daniel was always careful about that word, and he was right to be. But the reduction in chronic pain presentation is significant, reproducible, and unlike anything currently available through conventional pharmaceutical channels. She looked up. That's the medical reality. The legal reality is different. Tell me the legal reality. You have approximately 72 hours before Sloan's group files a motion in a federal district court claiming prior research interest in the compound based on correspondence their intermediary had with Daniel 18 months ago. Daniel responded to 2 emails from that intermediary. He thought he was talking to a graduate student doing general research. He was not. Those emails constitute documented contact. Pemberton will argue that constitutes a basis for a prior claim. She paused. It's a weak argument, but it's enough to initiate proceedings, and once proceedings begin, litigation, Maggie said, litigation, which they can sustain indefinitely, and you cannot. Nora laid 2 documents on the work table. What counters it is a prior rights filing a complete intellectual property registration that establishes Daniel as the originating researcher, documents the full timeline of development, and creates a legal structure around the work that makes a claim of prior interest by a third party demonstrably false. She looked at Maggie steadily. I have prepared the filing. I have a patent attorney in Missoula who has agreed to process it on emergency timeline. What I need from you is the authorization to proceed and the original notebooks as supporting documentation. Maggie looked at the documents on the table. Under whose name? She said. That's the question I need you to answer. Nora's voice was even without pressure. The filing can be in your name as estate executor. It can be in the name of a foundation or nonprofit entity. Or it can be structured as a research trust with specific governance provisions about how the work is used and by whom. She paused. Daniel had thoughts about this. He wrote them in the third to last notebook, the one from 3 years ago. I don't know if you've read that far. Maggie had. She remembered the entry. Daniel had written, if this becomes something real, I want it to belong to the people who need it. Not to me. Not to anyone who sees it as an asset. To the people who are living with the thing it addresses, and to the researchers who will take it further. I want it held in trust for that purpose specifically, and I want the governance of it to reflect that intention, not the intentions of whoever has the most money. A non-profit foundation, Maggie said. Nora nodded once. That's what I would recommend. It protects the research from acquisition. It creates a governance structure that requires the work to be used in the way Daniel intended, and it makes a hostile takeover significantly more difficult. She paused. It also means you don't get $5 million. I know. I want to make sure you've considered that clearly. Not because I think you should take the money, I don't. But because the decision needs to be made with full information. And $5 million is a real number. Maggie looked at her. Daniel spent 12 years on this without telling me. He did it because he thought I'd tell him to stop, that it was unnecessary, that the resources weren't worth it. She paused. He was right. I would have said all of those things. She looked at the notebooks on the shelf. and I would have been wrong about all of them. She turned back to Nora. File the foundation. Name it after him. Something shifted in Nora's face. Not surprise. Something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying a responsibility that was always meant to be shared, and has finally found the person to share it with. The Daniel Calloway Foundation, Nora said. Yes. They worked through the afternoon. Nora photographed every notebook page by page with a document camera she had brought in her canvas bag, creating a digitally time-stamped archive of the complete research record. Maggie organized the physical documentation into sequence. The early notebooks first, the correspondence with Nora. The patient records the formulation iterations and the final compound documentation. While Nora cross-referenced each piece against the filing framework her attorney was waiting to receive, Scout moved between them without interference. He lay by the door for a while, then near the work table, then at the center of the room, present everywhere. His calm was the calm of an animal that has assessed a situation and found it satisfactory, and is now simply keeping company. By 6 o'clock, the documentation package was complete. Nora sealed the physical copies in the evidence case she had brought. She sent the digital files to the attorney in Missoula. With a message Maggie read over her shoulder. 3 sentences, no elaboration. The message of someone who had agreed on a plan in advance and was now executing it. They sat across from each other at the work table in the quiet of the cabin as the evening light came through the vines in long amber strips, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He talked about you, Nora said finally. Often. He was proud of you in a way that was almost inconvenient. It came up constantly. A pause. He also worried. About the pain. About how you carried it without ever saying so. He said once that the hardest part of being married to a person who was very good at managing difficulty was knowing that they were managing difficulty and not being allowed to help. Maggie looked at the work table. He found a way. He always found a way. Nora stood, picked up the canvas bag. The attorney will file in the morning. I'll stay in Harlow tonight and handle anything that needs immediate response. She looked at Maggie. I think you should be prepared for Cormac to make a move when the filing goes through. He'll know immediately Sloane's team will see it and tell him, and he won't accept it quietly. I know, Maggie said. Will you be all right? Maggie looked at Scout. He was watching her from the center of the room. Yes, she said. Nora left at 6:15. The sound of her truck faded into the forest and the clearing returned to its own quiet, and Maggie sat at the work table in the amber evening light and let the stillness settle around her. She ate from the supplies she had brought in the truck. She read for a while, not the notebooks this time, but the letter again, the parts she had not yet absorbed fully. She checked the perimeter of the clearing twice, before dark old habit moving the flashlight beam along the tree line, with the systematic attention of someone who had done this in places where the stakes were considerably higher. She found nothing. The forest was what it appeared to be, deep, quiet, indifferent. She slept on the cot with Scout across the threshold of the door. At 2:17 in the morning, he was on his feet. She was awake before he moved in the way of light sleepers who have trained themselves to read the quality of silence rather than wait for it to break. She had felt the change in Scout's breathing, the shift from the slow rhythm of a resting animal to the controlled stillness of one that is receiving information and processing it. She lay still and listened. Footsteps, 2 sets, coming from the east side of the clearing, moving with the deliberateness of people who had been trained to move quietly and were doing their best, but on ground that was still damp from yesterday's rain, where even careful steps left evidence. They were not moving like hunters. They were moving like people who had been sent to do something specific and were focused on that specific thing, which meant they were not adequately focused on everything else. Maggie was off the cot in one movement. She crossed the cabin in the dark without the flashlight. She had walked the space enough times that the geometry was internal. Now the same way she had always internalized terrain before an operation, making the layout part of her own body so that darkness was not a disadvantage. She positioned herself to the left of the door, back to the wall, and she put one hand on Scout's neck. He was already in the posture she needed, ready-controlled, waiting for a signal. She listened to them approach. They reached the door. She heard something metal on the lock. Not a key, a pick, a tool, someone who had anticipated needing to bypass the mechanism. They were competent. The lock gave in under 40 seconds. The door swung inward. The first man came through at speed, and Maggie moved with him, not against him. The principle she had learned in the first weeks of her training and applied in more situations than she could clearly count. She used his momentum, redirected it, and the encounter was brief and decisive, and ended with him on the floor of the cabin, with no clear understanding of how he had gotten there. The second man in the doorway hesitated for the quarter second that hesitation cost you, and Scout came through the doorway low and fast and efficient, and the second man's hesitation extended considerably. It was over in under 90 seconds. Maggie turned on the flashlight. 2 men on the floor of the cabin. Neither were local, she could see that immediately. Nondescript clothing, the kind of anonymous that required deliberate effort, the opposite of the camouflage it was intended to be. No identification visible. She checked their outer pockets efficiently, the way she had been taught, and found what she expected to find. Nothing personal, nothing identifying. What she found instead was operational zip ties, a flashlight, a folded paper with what appeared to be an inventory list, and 2 phones. The phones were locked. She turned them over in her hand and looked at the cases, both in dark protective covers, both the same model. Not personal phones, work phones, issued rather than chosen. She turned on one of them and looked at the screen. Locked as expected. But the notification preview visible on the lock screen showed the last incoming message before it had been locked, which had come in 40 minutes ago, and which the user had evidently not had time to clear. A text message, no name, just a number and 3 words. Get everything, leave nothing. And below it in the same thread, the message the number had received in response to an earlier communication. She could not see confirmed. On site by 0200, she looked at the send number, saved in the phone as nothing, just digits. She took a photograph of the screen with her own phone. Then she looked at the second phone. This one had a different setup. Not a messaging thread, but an email application. And the lock screen preview showed the sender name for the most recent received email. She looked at the sender name for a long time. The name on the email was not Warren Sloan. It was not Aldrich Pemberton. It was not anyone associated with the investment group that had arrived in a black SUV with a prepared document and a practiced manner. The name on the email was Cormac Holt. She sat back on her heels. She thought about Cormac at the attorney's office, leaning back in his chair, with the posture of a man who had already decided how things were going to go. She thought about him in the clearing eyes, moving immediately to the hatch, assessing the cabin, with the gaze of someone cataloging rather than experiencing. She thought about him in the back seat of Sloane's SUV, saying nothing having already done what he came to do. Sloane and Pemberton were the visible layer, the professional face, the legal framework, the formal offer designed to establish good faith and create a paper trail that suggested legitimate business interest. But behind them, funding them, directing them, was Cormac Holt, who had known about Daniel's research for longer than he had admitted, who had been waiting for Daniel to die before making a move. Because Daniel alive would have been a different kind of problem, who had brought Sloane's group in as cover, and was now, when that approach had failed, sending people in the night to take what he wanted directly. She stood up. She looked at the two men on the floor. They were unhurt and increasingly aware of their situation, which she judged to be sufficient. She picked up her phone and called Nora. Nora answered on the second ring. "Maggie, Cormac Holt is behind it. Sloane and Pemberton were a front. He sent 2 people to the cabin tonight." A pause. "They're currently on my floor." A silence. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Is the documentation safe?" "Everything is with the attorney in Missoula. The originals are in the vault." Another brief silence, the sound of Nora thinking quickly, which sounded like no sound at all. "I'm calling the attorney now. This changes the filing approach we need to add a formal record of the attempted forced access. That goes into the documentation package as evidence of bad faith action by an identified party." Her voice was precise and focused, the voice of someone who had converted alarm immediately into action. "And Maggie, this means Cormac will know the filing is coming and will know his name is attached to an incident report. He's going to move faster." "Then we move faster," Maggie said. She secured the cabin. She drove the 2 men to the edge of the county road and left them with their phones minus the photographs she had taken, and the clear understanding of what an incident report involving their presence at a private residence at 2 in the morning would mean for them specifically. They did not argue. She drove back to the cabin. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running and Scout beside her, and she looked at the dark shape of the building against the trees. Then she drove to Harlow. Cormac Holt was staying at the Ridgeline Motor Inn on the south edge of town. She had gotten the name from Arlo Cavanaugh that morning, who had seen the rental car in the lot and recognized Cormac from the funeral. She pulled into the parking lot at 4:15 in the morning and sat in the truck and considered for a moment what she was doing and whether it was the right thing. She decided it was. She knocked on the door of room 7. A long pause. Then footsteps. Then the door opened and Cormac Holt stood in the doorway in a hotel bathrobe with the disheveled look of someone dragged out of sleep who is trying to arrange their face into an expression appropriate for unexpected visitors. He saw her. The arrangement of his face changed. "Maggie," he said. "It's 4 in the morning." "I know," she said. "Can I come in?" He stepped back. She entered. Scout came in beside her and stood to her left, facing Cormac. His body language, the specific combination of alertness and stillness that communicated without ambiguity, that this animal had made a full assessment and was prepared to act on it. Cormac sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at Scout, then at Maggie, then at the bag she set on the small table by the window. She opened the bag and removed a folder, set it on the table, then another folder, then a third. She lined them up without rushing, without explanation, and she let Cormac watch her do it. "Those are copies," she said when she was done. "The originals have been submitted to a federal patent filing as of 45 minutes ago, along with a formal incident report documenting the entry of 2 unidentified individuals into the cabin at approximately 2:15 this morning, accompanied by communications evidence identifying the person who directed them." She looked at him. He was very still. "The Foundation filing names the Daniel Calloway Foundation as the sole rights holder of the research, the formulation, all associated intellectual property, and the property itself. The filing is time-stamped and filed. It is not a draft. It is not pending. It is done." She paused. "The governance structure of the Foundation makes it acquisition-proof. There is no offer that can be made that the Foundation is legally permitted to accept. The charter prohibits it. The research belongs to the people who need it. That's what Daniel wanted, and that's what the Foundation is built to ensure." Cormac looked at the folders on the table. His face was difficult to read. She had always found it difficult to read, and she understood now that this was deliberate, a practiced opacity that served him in situations like this. But underneath it, she could see something moving. Not guilt exactly. The expression of a man who has run the calculations and arrived at an answer he doesn't like. "You can contest the filing," she said. "Pemberton will tell you there are grounds. He'll be right that there are arguments to be made. He'll be less forthcoming about the fact that those arguments require years and will ultimately fail, because the documentation supporting Daniel's prior claim is comprehensive and time-stamped across 12 years, and the incident evidence creates a bad faith record that will follow every legal action your group takes." She paused. "Or you can walk away." A long silence. Cormac looked at the folders, then at Scout, then at Maggie. "He was my cousin," Cormac said. His voice was quiet, not defensive, almost something honest which surprised her. "I knew what he had. I knew for 2 years what he was building out there. He wouldn't talk to me about it, wouldn't let me be any part of it." His jaw tightened. That wasn't fair. Maggie looked at him steadily. "He built it for the people who needed it," she said, "not for the people who could benefit from it." Cormac held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not agreement exactly, but the recognition of a distinction he couldn't argue with. He looked at the folders one more time. Then he stood up and he walked to the door of the room and he held it open. "Good night, Maggie," he said. She picked up the folders. She walked to the door. She paused in the frame and looked back at him once, and he was looking at the floor. And there was nothing left to say. So she said nothing, and she and Scout walked back across the parking lot to the truck in the 4:30 dark. She sat behind the wheel for a moment. Scout settled into the passenger seat. He looked through the windshield at the dark road ahead with the calm, steady attention of an animal that has completed the work it was meant to do and is ready for whatever comes next. She put the truck in reverse, drove out of the lot, turned north. The filing took 3 more days to finalize. Nora's attorney, a thin, methodical man named Greaves who communicated exclusively through documents, and seemed to regard verbal conversation as an inefficient approximation of written language, processed the application with the urgency of a person who understood what was at stake and had chosen to care about it. Maggie drove to Missoula once to sign papers and sat across from Greaves in his clean, minimal office and signed everything he placed in front of her, and when it was done, he said simply, "It's filed." And she said, "Thank you." And they shook hands, and she drove back to Harlow. On the fourth day, she received a certified letter from Aldrich Pemberton's firm. She read it at the kitchen table in the house that still felt wrong in its geometry, with Scout at her feet and both mugs on the counter behind her. And she read it twice, to be sure she understood it correctly. It was a formal withdrawal of interest. Precise, impersonal, offering no explanation beyond a reference to changed business circumstances. No bitterness, no threat. Just the clean retreat of a group that had assessed the situation and decided the cost of continuing was not justified. Pemberton did not do this because he was good. He did it because Nora's attorney had been thorough, and because the incident report had created a liability that Sloan's investors would not tolerate, and because $5 million was a real number, but not an infinite one. And at some point, the calculation simply didn't work anymore. Arlo Kavanaugh came to the cabin on a Tuesday. He arrived in his old Silverado with the cracked mirror, and he walked across the clearing without favoring his left side as heavily as he had the first time she had seen him. And he sat on the low bench along the cabin wall in the morning sunlight and signed the document that Nora had prepared his name and his testimony, formally submitted the first evidence of record that the research had produced real results for a real person. He signed it slowly with the deliberateness of someone who understands that what they are putting their name to matters. "Thank you," Maggie said. "No," he said. "Thank you, and thank Daniel." She walked him back to his truck. When he had gone, she stood in the clearing for a while. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Montana October day that looked like a photograph. Pines black against a sky of absolute blue, the mountains visible for once, their peaks traced with the first faint white of early snow. The vines on the cabin had begun to turn at the edges, the summer green deepening toward amber and rust. The white flowers were still blooming. She had asked Nora about them early in the week. Nora had identified them by genus, a cultivated variety, she said, not native to this region. Someone had brought them here deliberately and planted them here deliberately and tended them over years until they had become entirely at home in a place they were never supposed to grow. Daniel had planted them. She had not needed Nora to tell her that. She went inside and sat at the work table and took out the letter one more time. She had read it many times in the past week. Each time certain lines had taken precedence over others, the way important things reorganize themselves according to what you are able to receive on a given day. Today she read the last paragraph. "Whatever you decide, I need you to know. One thing, I did not do this alone. I did it with you. You just didn't know yet." She folded it, held it in both hands, looked at the notebooks on the shelf. 12 years of them, the whole span of a decision made in love and carried out in patience, documented line by line in the careful hand of a man who had understood something about her that she had not understood about herself, which was that she was worth fighting for, even when she would not have agreed. Scout was at the doorway. He had been moving between inside and out all morning, keeping his own kind of watch. Now he stood in the frame and looked at her with those amber eyes that had always held more understanding than was comfortable to acknowledge. And he waited. She set the letter down on the work table beside the first notebook, and the last one and the jar of dark green liquid that had for a week now been sitting in the place of honor, at the center of the table rather than locked in the vault, because it was not a secret anymore, and it was not hers alone, and it did not need to be hidden. She stood up. She rolled her shoulders. The familiar complaint was there, but quieter. From further away. It had been that way since the afternoon she had measured a careful dose into a metal cup and drunk it in the cabin her husband had built for her without her knowledge. And while it was not gone and might never be fully gone, it had changed in the way that Daniel's notebooks said it would change, gradually with patience, towards something manageable, towards something she no longer had to organize her entire life around. She walked to the door. Scout stepped aside to let her through, then fell in beside her as she moved out into the clearing. The morning light was full now, coming through the pines in long, clean shafts that touched the dew on the grass and made it briefly brilliant. The mountains held their new snow. The air was cold enough to see. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin, at the vines and the white flowers, and the work of 12 years of love worn into every surface. She thought about what came next. Nora had a list, researchers, clinicians, a small hospital system in Missoula that had expressed interest in a collaborative pilot program under the Foundation's governance structure. There were regulatory processes, formal trials, the long and necessary work of transforming a private research record into something that the world could access and evaluate and use. It would take years. It would require everything she had and some things she would have to learn. She thought about Arlo Kavanaugh signing his name slowly with understanding and driving home in his old truck with the cracked mirror. She thought about all the other names in the envelopes. She put her hand on Scout's head. He was warm in the cold morning air, solid and steady and entirely present, the way he had always been. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go to work." Scout looked up at her once. His tail moved a single, deliberate pass the way it always did when a decision had been made that he agreed with. Then he turned and she turned with him, and they walked together out of the clearing and into the trees. And behind them the cabin stood in the morning light, with its vines and its white flowers and its 12 years of quiet, patient love. No longer a secret, no longer hidden, just the place where everything had begun waiting now, for everything that came next.